Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk to you about some of the work we've done in terms of phenotyping and characterizing WAGR syndrome. So initial work was done back in 2005 by a different group that was looking to understand both the classic and non-classic clinical manifestations of WAGR syndrome, both in terms of diagnosis, evaluation, and clinical management. That initial study looked at over 50 patients ranging in age from 7 months to 4 years and reviewed both hospital records and asked parents to complete a survey of specific characteristics, and they came up with a bunch of recommendations for WAGR syndrome. Now, we were asked, in collaboration with the WAGR Association, to look at the data from the WAGR Syndrome Patient Registry that was initially conceptualized in 2012 in cooperation with the Global Rare Disease Registry, and then further launched by Kelly Trout and the Medical Advisory Board of the Association back in 2015. Now, this understanding how a patient registry works is complicated because you both need ways to protect the data, have consent forms so families can consent into the research, and then spread the information about the registries present to the families involved. The platform used for this registry was the Coordination of Rare Diseases at Stanford, or CORDS, at the Stanford Health System. And the way this registry works is that families could enter data based on a patient-based survey or family-reported survey, including about 70 questions that they could answer, and then researchers could access de-identified data through an application process to understand more about patients and propose a specific study for to use the data in the registry. So we were approached by Kelly Trout and John Morris to look at the registry data and try and understand more about the expanded phenotype of that. In order to do this, we applied and received access to the data. There were almost 200 responses from 131 participants, and then we had to decide within those what the criteria were for inclusion. There were some patients that didn't appear to be diagnosed with aniridia or WAGR syndrome, so we needed to remove those. There were several participants that did not complete the surveys. And what we ended up with was 85 patients that either had WAGR syndrome as their diagnosis, or they didn't select a diagnosis, but they had aniridia plus a key feature of WAGR. And in 16 cases, they just selected aniridia. So looking more closely at this cohort, there were 85 patients. There was more females than males. It was mostly a Caucasian demographic, and the ages ranged from 3 months to 46 years, while most of the patients were on the younger end. There was one patient that was deceased due to complications of Wilms tumor, but most of the patients were, all the other patients were alive to our understanding. Now here are looking at the classic features of WAGR syndrome, and just in light blue are the prior study results just to see how they compare to what we found. So we saw that 35 out of 74 patients, or about 50% or so, had Wilms tumor. 100% had aniridia. Genital urinary abnormalities were found in about 65% of patients, and there was a range of delays in terms of development in about 90% of patients. And here's the breakdown of patients based on having just aniridia or one or more of these key features. Other features, looking at more in depth, were broken into several categories. So we have the ear, nose, and throat category, where based on patients having sleep apnea or other issues that require tonsillectomies or adenectomies or ear tubes being placed. There was also about 50% of patients that had obesity and short stature. There was about a third of patients that had cardiovascular differences, about 20% to 30% depending on which type of feature for kidney issues. There was about 50% of patients had an orthopedic issue, whether it was hypotonia or Achilles tendon differences. There was about 40% that had an anxiety disorder and about 30% that had OCD in this group. In addition, in terms of sleep apnea, there were about 30% that had that, and about 50% reported less sleep than usual. There was also other findings, including involving ears differences. There was a small percentage that had some brain differences. And then in terms of vision, there was a whole range of things, some of which were part of aniridia and some things that were independent of aniridia. And there's a whole laundry list of things here in terms of eye findings that were reported. Keep in mind, these are all patient-reported results. So in some cases, there could be things that actually we could combine categories, but we weren't sure because it was all based on the responses to the survey. One thing I also wanted to note is that the data for gastrointestinal differences was not available in a format that we could use initially, and we actually just recently received that, so that's not included here, but there are some data to forthcoming on that. One thing that was different that we had more information about in this study compared to the previous one was there was 26 patients who were adults in this group. And looking at their health rating, that it looked like about half of them had a good health rating, and in 9 out of 24 had a very good health rating. So there was a range. A little bit less than half graduated from high school. Very few lived independently, and most were still single and not married, and these were all based on the questions that were asked in the survey. So the recommendations that come out of looking at all this data are similar to what was presented in the 2005 paper, with a couple slight differences. So it's important to assess children with sporadic aniridia for WAGR syndrome. And genetic testing is important. One of the challenges, which I'll get back to in a minute with this data, was that we didn't have genetic testing results for most of the patients. The next piece was Wilms tumor screening protocols. And based on the screening guidelines that I wrote actually in 2017, after reviewing all the clinically available data in the medical literature, was that we could screen for Wilms tumor up until the 7th birthday. However, it appears that there may be anecdotally a number of cases that are not reported in the medical literature of patients with Wilms tumors at a later time. And I'll get back to that in terms of future recommendations of additional things that we should potentially study to assess that more. It's important to assess for musculoskeletal abnormalities, sleep apnea, cardiac, and then behavioral and psychiatric disorders. There was something regarding females for streak ovaries and whether or not that was a change that was noted. It's important to educate caregivers on tumor screening and to encourage intervention services early, and it also discussed transitions to adulthood that are beyond the scope of the data we have here, but based on the fact that there are some lingering issues that move on to adulthood, it's something that needs to be studied further. The limitations of this study were that it was patient-entered data, and in some cases we had limited details or incomplete data. In most cases, we did not have genetic testing results, so we couldn't correlate a genetic testing result to a specific feature. And most of the patients in the group, still about 2/3 of them, were actually younger patients, so it'd be helpful to have more data on older patients so we can see how things move over time, plus it would allow us to see a spectrum across the lifespan. So in conclusion, this work validated the findings that the 2005 paper showed and opened up some additional areas for further study. It's important to think that there's a range of clinical conditions that make up WAGR syndrome, and that there may actually be a phenotypic spectrum of clinical features rather than just the specific features in the acronym for WAGR that we know. It's also important to think about genetic testing and education and what that means, both in terms of clinical features and in terms of additional clinical interventions. We also, at the moment, would recommend following the AACR tumor screening guidelines, but it's clear that further study is needed specifically in WAGR syndrome. And we need to think about the anticipatory guidance related to issues of transition of adult care. Future directions boil down to one particular thing, which is that we need more data. This is a very rare disease, and we need both information about many aspects of this, but particularly in terms of adult follow-up and tumor risk, we need to do more comprehensive studies and come together as a rare disease community to really understand this. We also need to consider integrating comprehensive chart review to further delineate some of these self-reported issues, and to understand more about genotype-phenotype analysis, which means that we actually need to review the genotype and the genetic testing results to correlate that to the clinical features. But most importantly with all of this is we need to collaborate, because the way to understand this, especially for a rare disease, is to work together to gather all of this data and to encourage people to join the registry and to join in additional studies that are being proposed to understand more about this. And my expertise in all of this really comes from my background studying another rare disease, which is Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, for which we have a comprehensive registry for these patients. And for BWS, we started this registry in 2014 to really understand the clinical and molecular aspects of BWS so we can improve care, both in children and adults. And this was the first registry to really comprehensively capture the spectrum we see in BWS patients. We've got hundreds of families from all over the world enrolled, and it's basically a combination of clinical and molecular data where we're abstracting that from medical records for the most part. So we're able to correlate what families tell us into the very specific, concrete, nuanced details and look for correlations between the genetic findings and the clinical findings and bringing all that together. And it's open to all families with BWS. And one of the things that it sounds like the association is considering doing is something similar to this, where in addition to the survey-based approach, to actually be able to do this more in depth so that we can all collaborate together to try and understand more about WAGR syndrome. And none of this would be possible without the support and engagement of the association and the CORDS registry group. And I would like to thank my research team, and some of the funding for this came through Alex's Lemonade Stand Foundation, and every year there's a fundraising effort, and I know there's a number of families that participated last year for this, and you can find more details at this link. And finally, patients and their families, because without you, there is no research to be done, and we really need to understand how we can partner together to understand more about rare diseases like WAGR. And I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to address any questions via the chat.